Have you ever heard of a man who started his life promisingly, with every chance of success, but ended in a tragic way? Now imagine someone who received a great mission from God, being chosen to govern his people with the promise of a lasting and blessed lineage. This man, with everything in his hands, not only failed, but became an example of ruin and disobedience. Jeroboam, the first king of the northern tribes of Israel, had everything to be remembered for his greatness. However, he ended up being known as someone who led an entire nation into idolatry and away from God. For many who read the Bible, Jeroboam's name is linked to disobedience and God's punishment. But before jumping to conclusions, it is important to know Jeroboam's full journey. From the time he served during Solomon's reign, through his rise as king of the northern kingdom, to his sins and the complete downfall of his dynasty due to God's judgment. His story is not just about the mistakes of a leader, but a reminder of how our choices can affect not only us, but also everyone around us. But how did this king, chosen by God, stray so far? How did his path go from promising to one of the saddest in the history of Israel? This is exactly what we will talk about in this video. Watch the video until the end, because this story will surprise you. Jeroboam came from a simple family from the tribe of Ephraim, one of the most important in northern Israel. He was the son of Nebat and Zeruiah, and he grew up in an environment of hard work and effort. The Bible doesn't say much about his family, except that his mother was a widow, which indicates that Jeroboam may have faced challenges from a young age. As an adult, he stood out for being a dedicated, skilled worker with a talent for leadership. His qualities caught the attention of King Solomon, who made him head of the workers from the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh. One day, while Jeroboam was outside of Jerusalem, he met the prophet Ahijah, who was from Shiloh. Ahijah was wearing a new cloak, and upon meeting Jeroboam, he tore the cloak into 12 pieces and gave 10 to him. This gesture symbolized that the kingdom of Israel would soon be divided. The message was clear. Because of Solomon's sins, who had turned to idolatry under the influence of his foreign wives, God had decided to split the kingdom. However, Ahijah also brought an important promise from God. If Jeroboam obeyed God's commandments and followed his ways, just as David had done, God would give him a strong and lasting dynasty in Israel. The promise of greatness and stability was, however, tied to obedience and faithfulness to God. Ahijah's prophecy and Jeroboam's growing popularity soon reached Solomon's ears. Fearing a possible revolt and the loss of part of his kingdom, Solomon tried to kill Jeroboam. To escape, Jeroboam fled to Egypt, where he found protection with the Pharaoh. This time in Egypt was a period of exile and preparation for Jeroboam, while he waited for the right moment to return and fulfill God's promise. After Solomon's death, his son Rehoboam took the throne of Israel. But he soon faced a great challenge. The northern tribes were dissatisfied with the heavy taxes and forced labor that Solomon had imposed in the last years of his reign. This abuse caused great discontent among the people. Jeroboam returned from Egypt and joined the leaders of the northern tribes to ask Rehoboam to reduce the burdens imposed on the people. Rehoboam asked for 3 days to think and consulted the elders who had served his father, Solomon. They suggested that Rehoboam lighten the load on the people to win their loyalty. However, Rehoboam ignored this advice and preferred to listen to his younger friends, deciding to increase the demands on the people even more. As expected, this decision left the northern tribes outraged. They rejected Rehoboam as leader, stating that they no longer had any part in David's lineage. Thus the 10 northern tribes broke away, severing ties with David's dynasty, and Rehoboam was left with only the tribes of Judah and Benjamin. In this scenario, Jeroboam was crowned king of the northern kingdom of Israel. After taking control of the 10 northern tribes, Jeroboam focused on strengthening several important cities. He did this to protect his kingdom from possible attacks and to ensure his rule over the territory. Among these cities were Shechem, in the mountains of Ephraim, where he established his capital, and Penuel, east of the Jordan, both with strong ties to Israel's patriarchs. By fortifying these cities, Jeroboam demonstrated his concern for defending the kingdom against internal and external threats. The division between the north and the south did not bring peace between the kingdoms. There was constant tension between Jeroboam, king of the north, and Rehoboam, king of Judah. Rehoboam even considered starting a war to reclaim the northern tribes, gathering a large army. However, he was stopped by Shemaiah, a man of God, who received a message from the Lord instructing them not to fight against their Israelite brothers. Even with the command not to fight, small skirmishes continued to occur between Jeroboam and Rehoboam. When Rehoboam died, his son Abijah took the throne of Judah, but the rivalry between the two kingdoms did not end, leading to a great battle during Abijah's reign. In the book of 2 Chronicles, chapter 13, we read that Abijah gathered an army of 400,000 men, while Jeroboam had twice as many soldiers. Despite being outnumbered, Abijah believed in God's promise to the house of David and declared that the Lord was with Judah. With this confidence, he managed to defeat Jeroboam's army, killing 500,000 soldiers of Israel. Before all of this, Jeroboam may have faced the threat of Egypt in his territory. During his reign, Shishak, the pharaoh of Egypt, invaded the kingdom of Judah in the 5th year of Rehoboam's rule. Shishak plundered Jerusalem and took the treasures from the temple and the royal palace. Although the Bible does not mention Shishak directly invading Jeroboam's kingdom, it is possible that Egypt impacted both Judah and Israel, as it was a major power at the time. Some historical sources even suggest that Israelite cities were conquered by the Egyptians. In the final years of his reign, Jeroboam continued to focus on maintaining his power and stability, but his rule was marked by idolatry and disobedience to God. This period was one of great spiritual and moral decline for Israel. Jeroboam reigned for 22 years, but his story was tarnished by the sins he committed and the idolatry he introduced. To understand the tragic end of Jeroboam, we need to see how idolatry grew during his rule. Afraid of losing power, since the people continued going to Jerusalem to worship at the temple, Jeroboam made a drastic decision. He had 2 golden calves made and told the people it was too tiring to go up to Jerusalem. He then suggested that those calves were the gods that had brought them out of Egypt. This action recalled the episode from Exodus when Aaron made a golden calf while Moses was on Mount Sinai. This was not just a strategic mistake, but a clear violation of the first commandments, which prohibit the worship of other gods and the creation of images. Some scholars believe that Jeroboam was trying to bring calf worship into Israel, similar to what Aaron had done in the desert. He distorted the worship of the Lord and created 2 centers of worship, one in Bethel in the south and another in Dan in the north of the kingdom. Bethel was a place of great spiritual importance, known for being where Jacob had the vision of the ladder to heaven. Dan, in turn, was one of the northernmost cities of Israel. By creating centers of worship in these places, Jeroboam led the people away from Jerusalem, which was the spiritual center chosen by God. In addition to making idols and establishing new places of worship, Jeroboam also disobeyed God's orders regarding the priesthood. He appointed priests from any people, not just from the Levites, who were the tribe designated by God for this service. By doing so, he created an illegitimate priesthood, compromising the sanctity and purity of worship to God. Jeroboam also instituted a new festival in the 8th month on the 15th day, imitating the Feast of Tabernacles, which was celebrated in the 7th month. This change in date was not approved by God and was another effort by Jeroboam to create his own religious system, distancing the people from true worship and maintaining control over them. Jeroboam made the decision to create these false worship practices consciously and deliberately. He thought that by creating more accessible places of worship, he would secure the loyalty of the people. However, this plan completely ignored the fact that Jerusalem was the place chosen by God for his temple and disregarded the need to follow God's instructions for proper worship. Nevertheless, Jeroboam had the chance to repent. A prophet, whose name was not mentioned, was sent by God to Bethel, where Jeroboam was offering sacrifices on the altar he had built. When he arrived, the prophet from Judah proclaimed a message from God against the altar, saying that a descendant of David, named Josiah, would be born and would desecrate that altar by burning human bones on it. As proof that his message was true, the prophet said that the altar would crack and the ashes would fall. Upon hearing this, Jeroboam, furious, stretched out his hand and ordered that the prophet be arrested. However, his hand became paralyzed and he was unable to move it. At the same time, the altar cracked and the ashes fell, exactly as the prophet had said in the name of the Lord. Frightened and humbled, Jeroboam asked the prophet to pray to the Lord to heal his hand. The man of God prayed, and the king's hand was restored. This event reinforced God's message of judgment, but also showed that he was willing to hear prayers and offer grace even in times of judgment. Despite this, Jeroboam did not change his behavior and continued disobeying God, becoming the first of many kings of the north who promoted idolatry. Around 300 years later, during the reign of Josiah, the prophecy of the prophet from Judah was fulfilled. Josiah, a king who sought to reform the kingdom, carried out a great cleansing in Judah and Israel. He destroyed the idolatrous altars and desecrated the pagan places of worship. When he reached Bethel, he burned the bones of the idolatrous priests on the altar that Jeroboam had built, exactly as the prophet had said. Jeroboam's sin brought serious spiritual consequences for Israel. By introducing idolatry, he caused the people to turn away from God in a persistent and evident way. This departure from true worship created a pattern of unfaithfulness that lasted for generations, eventually leading to the fall of the northern kingdom. Even during Jeroboam's reign, the Lord, through the prophet Ahijah of Shiloh, announced that the northern kingdom would fall and its people would be exiled because of idolatry. In this context, Jeroboam's sad end was also foretold. The story begins when his son Abijah became gravely ill. Worried about the boy's health, Jeroboam sent his wife, disguised, to seek the prophet Ahijah in Shiloh. Perhaps feeling guilty for his sins, Jeroboam may have thought that if his wife was in disguise, the prophet might give a more favorable message about his family. When Jeroboam's wife arrived at Ahijah's house, the prophet, even though blind due to his age, already knew of her arrival because God had informed him. He knew the reason for the visit and had a message of judgment for Jeroboam and his family. The woman's disguise did not work, and Ahijah announced God's judgment on the house of Jeroboam. According to the biblical text, the message was clear and harsh. Because of Jeroboam's sins, and because he had led Israel to sin, God would bring disgrace upon his family. All the men of Jeroboam's household would be exterminated, and his descendants would be wiped out, as if swept away like dung until nothing remained. Ahijah's prophecy included an immediate sign. As soon as Jeroboam's wife returned home and entered the city, her son Abijah would die. And as the prophet had said, this happened. All of Israel mourned the boy's death, who was the only one in Jeroboam's family to receive a proper burial, because something good was found in him in the eyes of the Lord. However, the other members of Jeroboam's family would have their bodies devoured by dogs in the city or by birds in the field, a sign of great humiliation. The complete destruction of Jeroboam's house occurred later, when Baasha from the tribe of Issachar conspired against Nadab, Jeroboam's son, and killed him. Nadab, who had succeeded his father as king of Israel, ruled for only 2 years. Baasha exterminated all of Jeroboam's family, fulfilling the word of the Lord given by Ahijah. This event marked the end of Jeroboam's dynasty, the king who became known for leading Israel into sin. The Bible does not provide many details about how Jeroboam died, but it is believed that his death occurred shortly after that of his son, Abijah. An interesting detail is that in the Hebrew text of the Old Testament, the name of Jeroboam's wife is not mentioned, but in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Bible, she is called Ano, an Egyptian woman connected to the Pharaoh. Jeroboam's story makes us reflect on how our choices, especially in relation to our faithfulness to God, can influence our lives and the people around us. We live in times when being upright and faithful is challenged by many external and internal pressures. As we study Jeroboam's life, we should ask ourselves, are we following God's path, or are we allowing our desires and fears to control us? The trajectory of Jeroboam and God's judgment upon him clearly show divine justice. Although God is merciful and patient, the judgment upon Jeroboam shows that he is holy and does not tolerate sin. As the leader of Israel, Jeroboam had the responsibility to guide the people in the true worship of God. However, by introducing idolatry, he not only sinned, but also led the entire nation away from God. This reminds us that spiritual leaders have great influence, and when they stray, they can cause enormous spiritual harm. Jeroboam's story serves as a warning to all leaders. It is crucial that they remain faithful to God and His commandments, for they will be judged with greater strictness. Even so, we see a sign of God's grace in the midst of judgment. Abijah, Jeroboam's son, was seen as someone with something good before God, reminding us that even in times of great wickedness, God recognizes and rewards what is good. The mercy of God is a central and constant theme throughout the entire Bible, showing that even in the worst circumstances, there is always an open door for redemption and restoration. God, in His patience and kindness, extends opportunities for repentance, offering hope even to the hardest of hearts. However, God's judgment upon Jeroboam and the subsequent destruction of his household highlight another aspect of the divine character: His holiness and justice. God does not overlook sin, and there are inevitable consequences for those who reject His will and lead His people astray. Jeroboam's story is a powerful example of how sin has a profound and lasting impact, not just on the individual, but on an entire nation. By introducing idolatry in Israel, Jeroboam caused the people to turn away from God in a massive and prolonged way, leading generations into a life of disobedience. This act not only corrupted Israel's spirituality, but also triggered a series of events that culminated in the fall of the northern kingdom. Jeroboam's choice, which could have made him a faithful leader guiding Israel in obedience, ended up turning his dynasty into a symbol of sin and decay. Jeroboam's story teaches us valuable lessons about the seriousness of sin and the inevitable consequence of disobedience to God. It warns us of the great responsibility that spiritual leaders carry and how a life of faithfulness to the Lord is crucial, not just for ourselves, but for all those we influence. More than that, this story reminds us that despite everything, God's mercy is always available and redemption is possible for those who turn to Him sincerely. God, in His holiness, demands justice, but He also extends His grace and mercy to those who seek to walk in His ways. Now write in the comments if you were already familiar with Jeroboam's story, leave a like on the video, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos. May God bless you.